Hello viewers, I'm Bhatti, CEO of PAS. In this video, I'm going to share and explain to you the tax implications for an employee and a self-employed person in Canada. This video is only for educational purposes. However, if you need any specific advice on tax and accounting matters, you can always call us at 289-952-3494, or else you can send us an email at pasca2017@gmail.com. I've divided this presentation into three segments for clarity. In the first segment, I'm going to explain to you the difference between an employee and a self-employed person under the Canadian tax law. And then I'll explain to you some of the tax implications for an employee and a self-employed person. And finally, I'll leave it to you that under the circumstances, what should be your choice. Now, whether somebody is an employee or a self-employed person is a question of fact. So it means in case of a dispute, if somebody, for example, has filed their T1 return and they are claiming in that return that they are self-employed or they are employees, then of course the CRA, if it does not agree with it, then it is going to apply certain tests in relation to question of fact. So what those tests are? First test is called the relationship test. So CRA would first of all look into the degree of dependence or independence enjoyed by the tax filer. So normally it is assumed that an employee is dependent upon his employer for multiple reasons in relation to the scope of work, for example, as we'll see in subsequent slide, and of course timings to attend the office, etc., etc. But in case of a self-employed person, for example, there is sufficient degree of independence in all these matters. Now, second important question of fact relates to the control. So if control is present, so it means one person who is the tax filer in this case, he is controlled by another individual, then probably the situation may be akin to an employer-employee relationship. On the contrary, if this control appears to be absent, then probably the tax filer may be treated as a self-employed person or as an independent contractor. The third test relates to scope of work. Under the employment law, generally, the scope of work involves compulsory tasks that have to be performed by the employee. While in case of a self-employed person or independent contractor, there is a degree of discretion that is also provided to the contractor in relation to scope of work. Then another important test relates to the suggestions that may be offered by the employee or the self-employed person. For example, if somebody is working as an employee, they may offer certain suggestions to their employer, but those suggestions are merely advisory in nature and the employer is not bound to accept those suggestions. While if you are working as a self-employed person or the independent contractor, those suggestions are normally considered binding on the other party, the person who has engaged you into that work or job. Now, in relation to jobs, one important point that we need to keep in mind is that majority of the employers would include a clause in the employment contract that during the tenure of employment, you are not allowed to work for another company or organization or person. So if any such condition is present within your employment contract, you may be treated as an employee. On the contrary, if you're allowed to do multiple jobs as independent or self-employed person, so then you may be deemed as an independent person or a self-employed person or a contractor. Now, what could be the tax implications both for an employee or a self-employed person? Now, first area relates to the deductions. We know that if you are working as an employee or probably even a self-employed person, there are some deductions, mandatory deductions that have to be made. For example, deductions towards Canada Pension Plan, deduction towards employment insurance, and deduction towards your personal income tax liability. So if you're an employee, all these deductions are made by your employer under the law. And it is your employer that has to remit all these deductions on a monthly or quarterly basis, as the case may be, to the CRA. On the contrary, if you are a self-employed person, you have to make all these deductions by yourself and remit the amount to the CRA. Now, in relation to filing of tax return, there are two different deadlines. If you're an employee, usually the deadline is 30th April of each calendar year. But if you are a self-employed person, the deadline is usually June 15th. Now, why there's a difference between the deadline? This is for the obvious reason that if you're an employee, what you have to get from your employer is T4. That is going to explain every bit of gross revenue that you have earned or salary you have earned and all deductions that have been made by your employer. So you don't have to really prepare any special accounts to file your tax return. On the contrary, if you're a self-employed person, there could be numerous business transactions relating to different types of revenues that you have generated during the past year and different type of business expenses that you have incurred. You have to make certain adjustments, etc., etc. So it means you need time to prepare your accounts, determine your net income, and then file your tax return. So keeping in view all these ground realities, the deadline for filing the tax return for an employee is 30th April, while for a self-employed person, this is June 15. Now, another important area where different treatment may be offered to an employee as well as a self-employed person relates to different types of business expenses. For example, there are different types of expenses that one has to incur. For example, traveling cost, meals and entertainment expenses, and many other types of business expenses. So normally what happens is that if you are an employee, although you have to incur traveling costs, for example, from your home, you're going to your place of work on a daily basis, but you cannot claim this traveling cost as a business expense. Similarly, at times at workplace, you have to eat something, you have to buy something as meals, but still you cannot claim it as your business expense. Now, a simple illustration is going to explain that how treatment of these expenses may affect your tax liability. Because if you're a self-employed person, you're allowed to claim your traveling costs, you're allowed to claim 50% of your meals and entertainment expense as your business expense. And there are other types of expenses also in relation to like use of cell phone, use of motor vehicle, etc., etc. But anyway, just to keep this illustration simple, we'll focus on only three distinct expenses. Now, as you can see in the slide, we assume that there are two situations. One relates to the employee and other relates to the self-employed person. And for simplicity and of course for a better comparison, we assume that the salary of the employee is deemed to be $100,000 per annum, and the gross revenue earned by the self-employed person are also deemed to be $100,000. Now, there are certain expenses which both of them have incurred. And again, for comparison purpose, we assume that the traveling cost incurred by the employee is $10,000 per annum, while for the self-employed person, this is also $10,000. When it comes to business meals, it is $3,000, 50% part of the total expense. And for self-employed, this is again $3,000. And business use of home expense, it is $4,000 for both employee and self-employed, because we know that as an employee at times we work from home, because many employers in Canada are now offering this flexibility to their employees that they may work from home during any specific days in a week or month, as the case may be. And as self-employed, you can also work from your home. Now, what is going to happen is if you're an employee, these three business expenses you cannot claim. So for tax purposes, your taxable income will be considered as $100,000. On the contrary, if you are a self-employed person, you'll be allowed to make deduction of these three expenses, business expenses, from your gross revenue, and your taxable income will be deemed to be $83,000. So this simple illustration explains that if you're a self-employed person, you are in a better position to reduce your tax liability legally by claiming some of the business expenses that may not be admissible to an employee. Now, what should be your choice under the circumstances? Of course, the answer to this question is not very straightforward or simple. Purely from tax perspective or on the basis of the fact that you're going to reduce your tax liability by claiming some of the business expenses, you cannot advise somebody, okay, instead of being employed, you start doing a job. Because if you have to be a self-employed person, you need multiple skills, because you work as an entrepreneur. So it means you need to have marketing skills, you need to have expertise in the core area where you want to deliver your services, or you want to supply the products, and of course the networking, etc., etc. And the key point is that when you start a business, it may take months and years before you reach the break-even point, and then your business turns into a profitable venture. On the contrary, if you're an employee, you know that at the end of very first month, the income will start flowing into your pocket. So anyway, the answer to this question is not that simple, but those of you who can really take this aspect into consideration, they feel that they have the courage, they are adventurous, they have, or they possess those expertise that may be required from an entrepreneur. So under the circumstances, a self-employed person would be in a better position purely from tax perspective than an employee if they are earning at more or less at the same level. So I hope you enjoyed this video. At the end, I reiterate that for any tax, accounting and business management related advice, you may call us at 289-952-3494, else you can send us an email at pascal2017@gmail.com, or else you may like to visit our website at www.pascal.com. Thank you for watching.